It's the After Show with TelecomTV's Guy Daniels and Ray Lemaitre.
Welcome to the After Show on TelecomTV. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content, and we are broadcasting live and waiting to hear from you, our audience, at the end of day 2 of the DSP Leaders Open Telco Summit. We have a great lineup of guests joining us again today, so keep your questions coming. You can use the form on the website below this video. As ever, I'm joined by Ray Lemaitre, Editorial Director at TelecomTV. Hello Ray, ready to go?
Absolutely, great to be here again in the TelecomTV Pleasure Dome and really looking forward to today's interactions. Today's roundtable on telco cloud and the role of the open source communities initiatives such as the LFN's Anuket is enabling these distributed architectures. That was a great discussion, providing fantastic insight into the developments that are truly important to the sector. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about these in the next 45 minutes. So back over to you, Guy.
Yes, thanks Ray. Well, time to introduce our guests who are anxiously waiting for our audience questions. And joining us live on the programme today are Yves Bellego, who is Director of Network Strategy for Orange, Paul Miller, Chief Technology Officer at Wind River, Beth Cohen, SDN Product Strategies with Verizon, Ildiko Vansha, who is Senior Manager Community and Ecosystem for the Open Infrastructure Foundation, and Diego Lopez, Senior Technology Expert at Telefónica. Well, hello everyone, good to see you all again. We've got lots of questions to get through in the programme, so Ray, over to you to get us started.
Okay, great, thanks Guy. Yves, before we start, a quick question for you, and we've been asking this of all of our guests this year. What got you into telecoms? How did you start your career in this industry?
Ooh, that was in fact 30 years ago exactly. So I started in 1991 and I started in the research center of what was at that time France Télécom, working on GSM. So defining the GSM standard, testing the first devices. A lot has happened since. And why did I come into telecom? Because I was previously working on the on IT. In fact, the reason, I chose to work on telecom was that I found that would be quite interesting for an engineer to join that the technological part would be interesting. And in fact, the following decades proved that I enjoyed a lot all the evolutions since then.
Absolutely. So a great choice, and hopefully one that many young engineers will be taking in 2021 and beyond. Okay, great. So here's our first question that's come from the TelecomTV audience. And the question is, to what extent is the use of open source software now a requirement for network operators? Is support for open source being demanded, for example, in RFP processes?
Yes, I'm talking about RFPs. I would say yes and no. I know RFPs are usually quite an important in the process within the operators, but the point is open source that starts much earlier. Because in RFPs, for two reasons. First, in RFPs, there are a lot of things that are being asked. All the traditional requirements on price, on performance, on resilience, and more recently we added a lot of new requirements on sustainability, on energy consumption, and so on. So there are so many requirements in RFPs. And the other point is, in fact, there are some decisions that are taken much in anticipation of the RFPs. And using or not open source is a type of decision that will impact the way we design the RFPs. So this is something to be worked on, to be envisaged, to be addressed before the RFPs themselves. And the RFPs will just be only one of the elements that will materialize usage of open source, but maybe not the main ones. What is very important is to jump into open source very early in the processes, not late, and not just ask suppliers, please use open source because that's fancy.
Okay, great. Excellent insights, Yves. Thanks very much. Anybody else want to comment on this? If not, we can move straight on to, yes, Paul. Paul and then Ildiko.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ray. I guess I'd certainly comment that from the RFPs we've been seeing, it's pretty pervasive. Yves is correct that you have the classical requirements of cost, power, performance, and core functionality that's required for the application. But for example, to bring a infrastructure solution into a service provider today that was not based on Kubernetes, that had some proprietary approach for cloud native, would not be accepted, right? So some aspects of open source are critical and pervasive throughout the RFPs that we see today. We also see that with the work that we do with the Open Infrastructure Foundation around Starling X being a major component of some of the distributed 5G work today, that is really welcomed because it is an open source community project that allows innovation from a crowdsourced model that benefits the service provider, but then they get the benefit of a hardened carrier grade deployment solution backed by vendors that is being put into their network. So I think we're continuing to see from the early days of NFV, now moving towards the edge of the network and distributed systems, the need for continued support of open source methodologies to drive the innovation within this market.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Paul. And Ildiko, you wanted to add something here as well.
Yes, I just wanted to emphasize on what the gentleman was telling before me, and also wanted to mention that I used to work for a telecom operator a couple of years ago. I will not say how many, but even back then, in connection to OpenStack, I already saw some mentions about wanting to have solutions that are based on open source projects in RFPs. But I also agree that RFP is just one driving force towards really making sure that open source has a foot in the industry. When we are talking about the movement, I think it is also important to see that some operators and vendors are further ahead than others. So the digitalization movement, the microservices, and all the open source parts, like the trust in open source, and then seeing the values and getting involved in open source, those are all part of a journey. And I'm really hoping that operators and vendors who are at the beginning of this journey, they will be able to benefit from the work that others have put into this, because open source is not just about the source code itself. It really is about collaboration and knowledge sharing and mind sharing. And it is also a really important part of technology innovation.
Absolutely, yes. And actually, we talked a lot and heard a lot yesterday about the new ways of collaborating in these sort of more open environments. Okay, so if we have no more takers for this question, we can move on to question number 2. Over to you, Guy.
Yep, thanks, Ray. And it's great to hear that Yves also shares 30 years in the industry, 1991 myself as well. So. Us old timers are still sticking it out. We've seen a lot of technologies come and go, and it's great to be on the cusp now, looking at what's coming and what we're implementing in the years ahead. Next question then goes over to Paul, and the viewer question is: we discovered, we discovered how you started, Paul, during the last DSP Leaders World Forum, about how you started in the industry, and also to our remaining guests. So we'll get straight into our viewer question now. So let's have a look at this next viewer question we've got in. And that is, how does a distributed open platform fit into an existing telco architecture? Is it run completely separately, or is it integrated with legacy OSS systems in some way? What would you say, Paul?
I would definitely say it's integrated, right? The ability for an operator to stand up a replicated environment for OSS BSS separate from their main infrastructure is not tenable, right? So you've got to have any new infrastructure components, like we're talking about a distributed infrastructure, especially at the far edge of the network, must be integrated with the backend systems. That's not only OSS BSS, but for example, big data systems that are doing day 2 operations of the environment, et cetera. With that said, there are some new challenges. The key word that you used in your question, in my mind, was the word distributed. That's a new area for the industry, right? As we've built these systems previously, for example, with NFV, those were in large data centers with highly scaled single instances for clouds. Now, as we go to a distributed model, that actually implies a geo-distributed deployment across a large footprint. If you think about a major telco operator doing this, they're talking about tens of thousands of sites that are now managed as an integrated system. This creates some new requirements and problems. For example, the need to do and support zero-touch deployment of that infrastructure or orchestration across a distributed infrastructure, right? And that the orchestration system needs to understand the fact that the system is edge-based and fully distributed to have policy and intelligent-based workload placement. So a lot of aspects of that kind of are new, and that's causing some opportunities to solve those problems in open source as well as in proprietary systems that can manage those types of distributed environments, but always integrated with the backend that exists in the carrier network.
Thanks, Paul. And Beth, do you want to come in on this question about the distributed open platforms and to what extent we can integrate with our legacy systems?
Yes, I definitely want to pick up on a lot of what Paul said, and there's absolute truth in that. And what I find with any telecom is that we never throw anything away. So we end up layering and layering and layering on existing systems, because the reality is that from a business perspective, setting aside the technology issues of doing the integration, the business perspective is that we can't yank out these systems that have been in place and working for many, many years. So we end up with I would say Frankenstein monsters for the most part, and one hopes that we can clear out some of the cruft over time, but I haven't seen a whole lot of that. So I'd say any of the new systems really need to integrate with the old systems, particularly the back end, the ticketing systems, the databases that are supporting, the inventory databases that are supporting our systems out there. I mean, let's not forget, we are frequently tracking, hundreds of thousands or millions of individual nodes. And, we can't just yank out a database and drop in a new one at a drop of a hat. So that's always a challenge. Yes, new systems absolutely have to integrate with the old ones.
Thank you, Beth. Yes, if only we could dispose of some of our older systems. Anybody else like to pick up on this whole topic of integration? Ildiko.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that you can also see the evolution path in open source. Like if you look into the projects that we mentioned already, like Kubernetes and OpenStack, they're both highly modular projects and tools, and basically you can see over the years that how the requirements are changing, and also you can pick up the pieces that you need, and then you can create a fusion between these two, and then you can run virtual machines, containers, and then who knows what other workloads in the future, sometime probably soon, I think this also kind of shows towards an evolution path, that you're not just throwing away a whole system that you have integrated already, but rather looking into how you can use the components and the bits and pieces in a new way.
Thanks, Ildiko. Yeah, designing for today's requirements with an eye on tomorrow as well. Diego, would you like to come in on this one?
Yeah, well, basically, when it comes to this, I believe that there is the need of integration. Normally, we tend to think in terms of adapting the new systems to the legacy ones. In reality, at the end, and something that is desirable and it's happening, is the fact that it's a process in which both are moving to find themselves at a common point. It's not only that we are deploying new systems, distributed, agile, based on composition, whatever. But at the same time, it's changing a little bit and making evolve the legacy systems precisely to support these deployment and operational styles. So at the end, it's an evolution in two directions, and so some kind of convergence, and that's I would say that's the idea. The wise way to go, so to say.
Thanks so much, Diego. Well, if nobody else wants to come in on this one, I would say, Ray, let's move it along to our next viewer question.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Guy. And a reminder to our viewers, please keep the questions coming in and we'll get through as many as we can. So, Beth, our next audience question is coming to you. And funnily enough, just a few minutes ago, you said that the telcos, the operators, never like to throw anything away. Well, this next question is, which systems or kit or technology will telcos be most happily to finally retire and get rid of thanks to the introduction of open architectures? So is there something that is going to be retired?
Yes, totally. Although it takes a long time. So one of the kit that we've been trying to get rid of for at least 5 or 6 years is DSL. Sadly, DSL is still out there, particularly in our rural areas in the U.S. I don't know about other parts of the world, but DSL relies on copper. I should pour out there, and the copper plant, as we call it, is getting more and more difficult to support. The other one that I know that we would love to get rid of, we actually recently announced that we're finally maybe going to turn it off, is 3G. My mother and my sister, who are still using 3G phones, will be horribly disappointed that they will have to buy a new phone. But as I keep explaining to my mother, your phone is 15 years old. It is time to get a new one.
Okay, excellent. Yes, Yves.
Yes, maybe in fact, I would have kind of the same type of stories, but to turn it positive. Why do we keep so long the old technologies? Just because we get revenues with these technologies, and in fact, the cost comes mainly when we deploy. And once it is deployed, in fact, we want to have revenues for years and years, and the operational cost is quite limited. So we need to find the right business case to get new solutions that provide similar revenues or similar services, so that we keep the customers and without having too many costs. So it's kind of really a business and economical equation that we need to solve, and that for long years lead to keeping a lot of technologies. There is a long list. We have still SDH, ATM, mobile circuits. By the way, we still have a lot of customers, not so many, decreasing, but we still have mobile circuit technology, PSTN on the fixed. So there are a lot of technologies like these ones, and we hope to be able to get rid of these technologies in the years to come, thanks to the modularity and the ability of the new technologies to replace these old technologies.
Okay, all right, interesting. And amazing to hear that some of the technologies that, people like Guy and myself have not talked or written about for maybe 10, 15, even 20 years are still out there and generating revenues. And that's something that maybe the industry forgets sometimes. Okay, if there aren't any more comments on that question, then I'll hand back over to Guy for the next audience question. Guy, over to you.
Thank you, Ray. And our next one, Ildiko, I think we'll ask you this one first, if you don't mind. And this is all about the operation of live networks. And the question is, what does the deployment of a distributed open platform mean for operations and also skills requirements within telcos?
In the past couple of years, I heard a lot of complaints in terms of how many of the processes are still kind of hand labor and manual work, and that operators were looking into or started to look into how to automate most of the processes that they have as much as they can. So, for example, I would mention the Airship project, which is another open source project. It is supported by the Open Infra Foundation, and it is targeting the deployment and lifecycle management type of actions for infrastructure, software, and really anything that comes in containers. It uses container technology for flexibility and more robustness. So in that sense, I believe the keyword really is automation here. And Paul also mentioned Starting X, which is more fine-tuned for edge, but it is also an example that it's using components from Airship, as well as looking into how to do that zero-touch provisioning as well, and really just double down on automation. And in that sense, I believe the skills are also kind of more focusing in that space, so that people need to have more of a systems view, as well as a really high motivation for automation and being able to pick up the new tools and new ways how these things are getting solved, both in open source as well as really anywhere in technology and how it all innovates.
Thanks, Ildiko. Well, let's ask Paul more about Starling X then, and also, Paul, what you think of the deployment of distributed, again, that word distributed open platforms, and what that means for operations within telcos.
Well, I have to say, I really agree with the points you just made. I think that, as we've started to learn from actual operational deployment of the Starling X technology at the edge of the network, things like zero-touch provisioning and zero-touch deployment become critically important, and that affects the skills of the people that deploy and manage the systems. The other thing is that you start to realize with a highly distributed edge system, such as being used for 5G vRAN, the ability for a human being to operationalize that is non-sustainable, right? There's too many tens of thousands of sites, upwards of hundreds of thousands of sites. And to try to manage that, both from a deployment paradigm, think of thousands of sites being deployed each week, right? That's a significant challenge to do. So you need to be able to have full lights out deployment onto that site. You also need to have what we call a concept of a digital feedback loop, where data from that site is continuously being brought back and ingested in automated systems, such as analytics and big data systems that have capabilities, for example, like AI and machine learning, that give you the ability to do predictive analytics and predictive outage avoidance and provide a high level of software automation in the platform. And therefore, the skills of the people that you're looking for are the ability to understand that data and manage a system via those types of automated software platforms. And that's a little bit new for the environment. The other thing that's a bit new is on the orchestration layer side, the ability to have, yes, as always, with things like ETSI NFO or ORAN around orchestration of the applications is important and more complex with the distributed nature of the network. But you also need to manage the infrastructure itself from a virtualization platform perspective from that same tool set, as well as the ability to extend and support the automations that the operations teams are trying to do. They're auditing firmware revisions, they're managing BIOS revisions and BIOS settings across thousands of systems. And to be able to put machine learning and automation on top of that to ease that operational burden has a direct correlation with OpEx and the types of skills you need to run and operate the network.
Thanks, Paul. It does seem to me that with the increase in automation, yet the requirement on skills and the skills level is just going up and up. I saw Yves' hand as well, but Beth, I think you wanted to come in this one as well. Beth.
Yes, I did. So what I'm finding is that traditionally network operations people don't have the same type of skills. That they tend to have skills around network performance and understanding networks. They have a deep understanding of networks. What they don't have is agile development skills and skills around net DevOps, let's say, and so they those are the skills that they really need to apply to these new networking paradigms. This is particularly going to be important as we move into intelligent networking and AI and machine learning, where we don't, network engineers are not data scientists, but we need to have them interface with data scientists. And it certainly wouldn't hurt if they gain some of those skills so that they can, in fact, interpret the system, the data, so that it can be applied to tune the network performance. Without that, it's garbage in, garbage out. So there's a lot of skills that network engineers can focus on, and I think it's important for them to keep their skills up.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. Yves, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Yes, just one additional point, just support all what has been said. And in the case of Orange, for example, that has also some impact on our organization. For example, in the past, we had the IT applications that were managed separately from the IT infrastructure. And then on the networks, we had the fixed access, radio access, transmission, transport, core networks. And with things like vRAN, we need to have the radio guys to talk with the infrastructure teams. And that is completely new. And that takes a bit of time. And we need to get all of them to understand all the new tools. How does zero touch work, things like that. So this just to give you some information, how this also has taken a bit of time to spread within our companies. Because at the end, we need to define the new domains, how we will organize, and how the processes will evolve. And this takes a bit of time.
That's good insight. Thank you, Yves. In that case, I think we shall move on to our next question and hand it across to Ray.
Okay, great. Thanks, Guy. Yeah, fantastic answers so far today. Just a reminder as well for people to get more questions in if you want this panel today to answer any questions you have. So Diego, we're going to come to you next with the audience question. And this one is, will open technology systems really help the network operators to avoid vendor lock-in? Or might it just be replaced with systems integrator lock-in instead?
Well, whatever is, we should not forget that if you are technology dependent, whatever the technology you are using, you will be dependent on the provider. Whoever is the provider, if it is a vendor, is a system integrator, or whatever else. The point here, what will be important is that to avoid whatever the locking and the possibility of transitioning from one to another and making decisions not necessarily based on legacy, etc., has to do precisely to have the knowledge or at least the key knowledge inside the organization. That is something that somehow is a little bit against the traditional behavior of telcos, at least in the last years, probably since the mobile deployments and all the like, in which, well, frankly, telcos are becoming more and more organizations focused on reselling or selling services and regulation, etc., and less focus on technology. Telcos need to get back to the good old days in which they were somehow leading the technology. Let's not forget that Unix itself, that is the grandfather of all the open source environments and all the like, was invented in a telco lab. And this is because by that moment, telcos were very much focused on technologies. For sure, there are many other things and you have to run the company, but the relevance of having knowledge, know-how inside your company and connecting it, and something that is important probably is not so much over-specialized when it comes to skills. Probably what would be more important is precisely to have people that have a general view, a holistic view of how the network behaves and the implications of the different pieces in making in building the services, making them maintainable, and making them, why not, profitable as well. So the avoiding the lock-in will come more from a change in the structure and the culture of telcos rather than in particular a concrete technology base. For sure, something like open source would help. And that's true. Whatever the open technology, it would help in that this generation of knowledge, accumulation of knowledge will be easier. But you need the will and the people to get this knowledge.
Okay, interesting. Great perspective, Diego. Thanks. Ildiko, I'll come to you next, and then Yves. So Ildiko first.
Yes, I just want to emphasize further on this topic. I mean, I think it really all boils down to business at the end of the day. Like we have open source software and open interfaces. We have standardization and standard interfaces. So we really do have, I believe, all the tools and components to get rid of vendor lock-in and interoperability problems, but we are still struggling with that. And I really think that it also goes back to how the business models are, what companies think the added value is, what values and services they deliver, how they deliver that. So I think it also depends on how that evolves in terms of when we are able to get rid of vendor lock-in. And of course, operators are in the position to drive this towards something more feasible. And the reason why I'm thinking that it really is more on the business side. I went today to buy coffee capsules, and I will not tell which store I was in, but they just released a new coffee machine that happens to need a new type of capsule, and I haven't seen that one, that shape and that size before, which kind of got me wonder that probably they just don't like that the other one got really popular all over, and they are not the only ones delivering that anymore. And that's coffee. That has nothing to do with telcos, and they are kind of dealing with the same issue.
Well, Ildiko, I would say that coffee has got everything to do with the telecoms industry. How else can we have a 24/7 operations? But it's a great analogy there. And so my advice is always buy the beans that you can roast yourself at home. But I digress. Yves, let's come to you on this matter. Lock-in, are operators going to get locked into systems integrators rather than their equipment vendors in the future?
Well, I would say hopefully not. But yes, integrator lock-in is a real risk, and that we are aware of. But there are ways not to fall into that trap. And the activities like the ones in Anuket, and we are heavily involved in Anuket as we were previously in OpenNFV, are the ways to avoid these integrator lock-in.
Okay, excellent, great point. And I'm going to come to Paul next, and then go up the stack to Beth. So Paul, next to you.
Thanks, Ray. Certainly a very interesting discussion. I think if we reflect back on what this industry was like 10 years ago and look at it now, it's dramatically different relative to lock-in. You think about the disaggregation that's now happened. We're moving from monolithic appliances where there's certainly a lot of competition and carrier power in the deal when they're initially selecting it. But if you pick a major infrastructure equipment vendor, integrate it in your network, then for a decade, you're locked in, right? Now, with disaggregation in the technology stack, you've got the separated layers of hardware, infrastructure, and application, and it's totally changed the game relative to lock-in. You think about the fact that a hardware provider of an x86 Intel-based off-the-shelf system that can be swapped out for another one, basically at the blink of an eye or the whim of the carrier. This enables competition throughout the entire life cycle of the network, not just during the initial commercial win. The same competition exists at the infrastructure layer for the life of the network and the application layer. I've witnessed an application being, punted out of a network at when that vendor disappoints the carrier, either commercially or performance-wise, it's the push of an orchestrator button to redeploy that system. So I think the carrier now is a much more powerful dynamic relative to vendor lock-in than they've ever had before, and it's very, very good for their business commercially. Now, as you go forward, certainly the SI can become entrenched in that carrier, but the vast majority, if you kind of think of a pie chart of the cost that the carrier has to spend, dominated by OpEx and then by the CapEx components for all the system elements we're talking about, the SI is actually a fairly small piece of that. So yes, they may get lock-in, but it's less commercially damaging than what we had for vendor lock-in previously. And then the only final comment I'll add is the jury's a bit out on what I call the east-west disaggregation for systems like O-RAN, where we're standardizing interfaces, APIs, and system functional blocks for 5G. That's not yet mature, and we'll see whether we actually see a multi-vendor environment running horizontally across the network as we go forward. But I think the hopes are high there as well, that the operator gets similar benefits and power and control over their commercial situation from that initiative.
Okay, yeah, excellent insights. Great points, Paul. Thank you. And Beth, we'll come to you.
So I wanted to pick up on what Yves was talking about. I think to a large extent, there is some technology, and obviously what Paul said about disaggregation has helped us be able to be more flexible and less vendor lock-in. But a key decision that the operator has to make is how much will they keep the skills and the development in-house, and how much they turn it over to an outside vendor, and what that outside vendor looks like. And I think, as Paul said, I think that's changed a lot over the last 10 years. I think 10 years ago, telcos tended to kind of outsource that whole thing to our vendors, particularly when it's an appliance. The vendors doing all the integration and everything. And I think as telcos, we backed into the role of systems integrators. I don't think we intended, and I don't think we quite understood when we backed into it what that meant. But I think we have embraced that now, and we do play a stronger role with, taking the parts, the bits and pieces from the various supporting vendors and putting them in together as we need them. And I know we've done a lot of work around virtual services and working with the vendors to make sure that they do actually port these services onto those universal CPs and x86 boxes, the disaggregated boxes. And that's been a journey for many of our vendors as well, where they don't really have a full understanding of what it takes to take what's essentially a piece of software, pull it out of their integrated appliance and put it on, a generic vanilla box. That's been a journey for them as well. And that's something that we've been able to share with our vendors in support. I think, there's always going to be some vendor lock-in, but, because telcos are in it for the long haul, and we need stability. But there's also been a lot less than there was, I'd say, maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Okay, excellent. Well, fantastic insights there. And I'm still a little bit overwhelmed by the fact that coffee pods got brought into this conversation. So I need to take a bit of a breather right now, and I'll hand back over to Guy.
Yes, thank you, Ray. Well, time is marching on, but it's been such a great discussion so far. But before we move on to our next viewer question, let me quickly tell you about the series of polls we are running. So for each day of the Open Telco Summit, we are posting a new poll question on the website related to the theme of the day. And each question's a simple multiple choice. So go ahead, just click on your choice of answer to make your vote count. And today's question is, are virtual machine VM platforms still an option for telcos? And we've got some live data coming in here. I'd say at a quick glance of that, it looks like there's still a lot of love around for VMs. So I shall just raise a quizzical eyebrow and leave it at that. I can't believe those numbers are going to stay that way for the rest of the week. But we'll keep the polls running all week, and we'll comment on those results later on TelecomTV. Right, back to our Q&A, and I think we've got time for a couple of quick questions. Ray, have you got anything for us?
Yes. This is another question that came in late yesterday, which I think we've got time to squeeze in. So the question, and this is to the whole of today's panel. So anybody that wants to come in on this question, please just raise your hand and let us know. And the question is, does an open approach put the pressure back onto CSPs to be more creative and ambitious innovators rather than just a pass-through for vendor kit features. So is the move to open architectures helping to make operators more innovative and creative than they were before? Does anybody want to come in on this question at all? Paul, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'll take a swing at that. I think that we talked earlier about the inclusion of open source in the transformation that's happening in the telecommunication network. And what that really represents is a conduit by which the crowdsourced innovation that open source really represents is being channeled into the telco network. And thus, yes, there's a tremendous amount of innovation there. And there's also, as we've experienced, innovation being driven by the carriers, right? Where the carrier sees a combination of open source capabilities or a transformation into a software-based network, for example, and they say, we'd really like it to take this next step to do X, Y, or Z. And that tends to drive contributions from the vendors back into open source ecosystem activities as well. O-RAN is a fantastic example of that, right? I don't think that would exist if not driven from the carrier interest. So I think there's a combination of innovation coming in from crowdsourced places like open source activities where you have, you look at the OpenStack activity, you've got 100,000 developers there. There's a tremendous amount of intellectual property being brought in there, or through large projects like Airship or Starling X that were mentioned within the Open Infrastructure Foundation, or even CNCF with Kubernetes and the projects that happen there. Obviously, these have had a huge impact on the network as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of innovation happening because of this. If you look at the old proprietary systems, the only steps forward that would take were iteratively at the decade level at, for example, 3GPP iterations for standardized network infrastructure offerings. That's where the innovation was driven. Now you've got a much more dynamic market that's being driven by open source more now in the current times than in past where it was driven by standards.
Yep, great. And I think we've all seen this happen in the past couple of years in particular. Great points. Going to come to Diego next and then across to Beth. So Diego.
Well, 10 years ago, when I rejoined ITF after some time, there was a word that was, that you could hear once and again, that was about ossification. That is, the whole protocol stack was extremely rigid and could not evolve because the wide usage of particular options was not, was stopping innovations to get through. I think that in the telco networks, the telcos have been ossified for a long, long time, probably since the last eclosion probably was the deployment of the mobile networks, whatever their architecture. And that implies this is an opportunity, an extremely good opportunity for, I don't know if de-ossification is the right word, but so to soften things a little bit. And that implies one important thing as well. This opportunity of de-ossification, of becoming more flexible, more agile, etc., implies that the competition is going to be much harder. There will be not necessarily competition only in prices, converge offerings, or subsidizing phones or whatever. The competition will be really on technology and the level of service and the kind of services and the agility in serving customers, etc. And that would imply that adapting and being able to evolve and being more creative is not only that is an opportunity, it will become a need that will be essential for surviving. If you in the future, I foresee that there will be strong changes in the telco landscape in the coming years. Precisely with there will be some winners, the ones who manage to adapt better and quicker, and some losers as well. Those who have not been who have remained somehow ossified.
Okay, great points. And if de-ossification isn't a word, it absolutely should be. Okay, so Beth, we'll come across to you now.
It's not defenestration, right? So I do. So I have found. My personal experience with being one of the early telecoms that brought out virtual services to our customers. Orchestration is a tool that we ended up going to our vendors and saying, we wanted to buy it, but we literally couldn't because it just didn't exist. So we ended up, working with the vendors. We built pieces of it ourselves. We ended up, as I said earlier, becoming integrators, even if we weren't really thinking of ourselves as integrators. So we definitely drove the capabilities of our vendors to support orchestration and automation. And ironically, some of the work that we did with these vendors a few years ago is now popping up as features that they offer to other telecoms. And that's, I don't know if that's, you could see it as a competitive advantage or not, because, at the end of the day, our customers don't buy orchestration and automation, they buy services from us. But so a lot of the work we did and has helped the vendors become more telecom friendly for the new systems. That's and of course a lot of that work came through the open source community and to a certain extent standards bodies as well. MEF and the work with SD-WAN is an example. The work with LFN Anikit, which was founded on we were realizing that there was a gap in there was a lot of projects working on VNFs and what they look like and automation and orchestration, ONAP. And what was missing was the infrastructure to support all these new systems. So that, 2.5 years later, that resulted in what's now the Anikit project, which is, very strong and definitely led by the telcos.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's we've clearly seen that. And then Ildiko will come to you. And then I think with that, our virtual studio manager is waving a flag at us. So I think we're coming to the end of the program, but I think we'll have time for one more question. But Ildiko, yes, please come in on this one.
Yes, I wanted to really just talk about this from the open source side. I mean, I think it has two sides. One is that open source really is more open collaboration these days, and it really is about that. So companies, organizations, individuals are working on common goals, common requirements, common challenges. And with that, they are kind of sharing the burden of maintenance, as well as developing the software pieces further, which kind of leaves more room for innovation on the side of each of the participating entity. And on the other hand, I remember that a couple of years ago, when we started to see telecom vendors and operators participating in the OpenStack community, we used to talk about enterprise IT companies and people and telecoms. And recently, I really haven't heard this boxing organizations and people, but really, it really is about mind sharing and sharing of knowledge and ideas. And I think it is also really important to see that there really doesn't seem to be an enterprise IT side and the telecom side anymore. Technology really brought these fields closer, and the lines disappeared. So open source is really showing a great example of, if you talk to people all around the world, from all around the world, doesn't matter who they work for, and so forth, really just talk about technology and innovation and come up with the best ideas and best solutions to today's and tomorrow's requirements. That really is the value of open source and open collaboration. And I think that is why it is so important that not just use open source software, but really participate in the communities who are working on them.
Okay, excellent. Well, it's definitely good to talk, and this is a great example of one of the platforms where we're able to share thoughts and ideas. So, Guy, I think back over to you for what I'm sure is going to have to be our final question for today.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. In fact, our studio clock's just gone dark, so that must be a subliminal message to us. Right, let's get one more viewer question is, because we really appreciate our viewers sending in the questions. So hopefully we can get some really short and succinct answers from you for this one. So here's the final question for today. Is there any evidence that the increased use of open source by telcos has broadened the application ecosystem and delivered greater access to a broader range of software options? Who would like to give their final comments on this one? Any takers for a quick yes or no? Paul, thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think that the answer is absolutely yes, right? As you've moved to a virtualized infrastructure that now eliminates the legacy barriers that you used to have to bring new applications into the network. And it enables a new ecosystem to grow more rapidly. It's fully software-based with applications that run in this environment. And even to the point of moving towards gallery-type capabilities where the service provider even has a catalog of applications to deploy both on their public and private cloud infrastructure. This is absolutely happening as we speak.
Thank you, Paul. And Diego, you wanted to come in as well.
Well, I'm not going to start any discussion. Yes, it's opening, it's broadening the ecosystem. It's broadening the number of options. It's allowing this de-ossification. And the important thing is that at the end, it's helping in this creativity we're talking about, because you are much more options, much more possibilities, much more ways of getting it wrong, but on the other hand, much more ways of making things that were not thinkable before happen. And this is extremely important.
Fantastic. Two positives so far. Beth?
I'll keep it short, but I think this is going to be a critical importance to MEC and 5G and the IoT type applications, where we are interfacing with a whole different ecosystem of developers that give us a broad range of services. We've seen that with the cell phone apps, right? The app stores, where literally there's hundreds of apps, and I think we're going to be seeing this across the industry. It's now able, as Paul said, for software developers to engage in the telco dialogue because they don't have to worry about the hardware anymore.
Thank you, Beth. Let's hope so. And Yves?
Yeah, well, I would say yes also, and maybe to come back to an example that Paul already gave not so long ago about the ORAN Alliance. And this is typically one of the great things that we are achieving within the ORAN Alliance, just to give an example.
Yes, indeed. And it is doing great work. And Ildiko, just to complete the set, our final thoughts from you.
Well, I would just say yes. And I think it really has a lot to do with accessibility and I can spin up OpenStack or Kubernetes on my laptop and run applications on top. So really that developers have this access to infrastructure software. I think it really makes a difference.
Very positive. Thanks very much indeed. We are out of time. We're going to have to end the show now. Thank you so much to all of our guests who joined us for this live program and to our audience for sending in those questions. Now, the Open Telco Summit continues tomorrow with another great panel discussion for you on the deployment of open source technologies in telco cloud strategies. There won't be an after show tomorrow. I know, I'm disappointed as well. But we will be back next month with a star-studded 5G Evolution Summit.
Guy, I enjoy these live shows so much. I think we should do one every day. Let's look into that. In the meantime, it's arrivederci from me.
And grazie a voi from me. Goodbye.
The after show was recorded in front of a live online audience.